All right, in this session, we'll be talking about word studies and how to find the meaning of words in context. Remember from our last session, context determines meaning, and words are like pieces of a puzzle. They fit together to form stories and paragraphs and letters and such. And so, until we know the meaning of certain words, we'll not be able to understand the meaning of a whole passage. So, the aim of a word study is to try to understand as precisely as possible what the author was conveying by his use of this word in this context. We do this with English words every day without realizing it. Take the word spring, for instance, in English. Depending on how I use the word spring in a sentence will determine its meaning. The same word spelled the same way, that sounds the same way, can have multiple meanings, depending on whether I'm using it in the context of the season, the spring season. I could be talking about the time of year. I could be talking about a spring in a pen, an ink pen, or in a car, an actual metal device. I could be talking about jumping, someone springing forward by the motion of their body, depending on how I'm using it. I could be talking about a source of water, right? A spring of water coming from the ground. And so the word spring can be used in multiple ways depending on context. Take the word trunk. I could say, I could be referring to a box, like a chest that you open and put items in, maybe in someone's bedroom. I could be talking about a tree. It has a trunk. I could be talking about a car, right? A car has a trunk. And on I could go with words. And then the same thing happens even with words like world and all in the Bible. Take, for example, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. And then you go over to John 12:19, and the same book, the same author, and the Pharisees are upset with Jesus, and they say, we have to put a stop to this guy. Look, the whole world has gone after him. Well, clearly, do they mean every single person that was living on the earth at that time? Were they following Jesus? Of course not. They were using world in the sense of an exaggerated statement of, look, all kinds of people, large groups and crowds of people are following Jesus. You take the same author in a different book. Take 1 John chapter 2, and the Apostle John says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him, in John 2:15. Well, no, wait a minute. I thought God loved the world, but then we're told not to love the world. Which is it? Well, it's a different meaning. Right? The context of 1 John 2:15 is talking about the evil world system, the humanity opposed and in rebellion to God is the meaning of the word world in that context. And so if you look across the scriptures, you can find that the word world has 6 or 7 meanings depending on context. Same word, cosmos in Greek, same spelling in English, W-O-R-L-D, pronounced the same way, but has vastly different meanings. And so I think you see the significance of understanding words in context. Or take, the word all. Does all always mean all? What do I mean? Well, I think of Mark. I think of Mark's gospel. I'll turn there for a moment. Chapter 1, where John the Baptist is baptizing in Mark 1:5, and all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Well, does that mean that every single person in Judea and in Jerusalem were being baptized by John? Does that mean that Pontius Pilate, who was living in Jerusalem at the time, the Roman governor, was he baptized by John? Or Caiaphas, the high priest, was he baptized by John? No, clearly all is speaking in a representative way. All sorts or all kinds, all types of people from various backgrounds, Jews and Gentiles, and men and women, and old and young, and Romans and Jews, and rich and poor, and all kinds of people were coming out and being baptized by John. And so we have to say all. What does all mean in the context and to common sense? I think also of the birth account of Jesus. All right, Luke 2, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. All the world. Does that mean people in China who were living in ancient China, were they being registered for the taxation under the Roman Empire? Right? Does all the world mean the entire globe, or does it mean all of the known world? Of the context of the day, the Roman world, the Roman Empire. We could, if you look at all the uses of world, you could think of the earth, the ground, the dirt itself is, the world's referred to as the earth is referred to as the world. There are many uses of that term, and so again, I'm just making the point of word studies matter, and so that's what we're talking about, is to know a word in context. One of the dangers that you find in trying to do word study that we need to avoid is the English-only fallacy that is referenced in your chapter on page 164. What is this? This fallacy occurs when a student bases a word study on the English word rather than the underlying Greek or Hebrew word, and as a result draws unreliable or misleading conclusions. So how do we avoid this mistake? We should remember that a word in Hebrew or Greek is often translated into English by a number of different English words. Remember that different words in Hebrew and Greek can be translated into English using the same English word. And so what we want to do is learn how to use study tools well. Obviously become familiar with and competent in the original languages as much as possible is always a good thing. How to use a concordance is important, and be able to look up the original word in the original language that is behind the English word in the verse that we're studying. So that's one common fallacy. Another common fallacy is the root fallacy. This fallacy believes that you can find the real meaning of a word if you can identify its original root. And so this is described here as, in your chapter, it says, it is true that a word's individual parts may accurately portray its meaning, but only if the context supports such a meaning. So give context priority over etymology, and you'll be on solid ground. So it's common. Your chapter also says one of the more common fallacies is the notion that the real meaning of a word is found in its original root. But then they said, think about how silly this can be even in English. Is a butterfly actually a fly that has lost control and crashed and landed into a tub of butter? Right? So switching from English to a biblical language doesn't automatically change things. So we need to know the real meaning. The meaning of a word is what is found in its surrounding context. There's also the time frame fallacy mentioned. The fallacy occurs when we latch onto a late word meaning and read it back into the Bible, or when we insist that an early word meaning still holds when in fact it has become obsolete. So one of the common examples that is used and is mentioned here is dynamite, right? The Greek term dunamis, sometimes translated power in the New Testament. and we try to read that back and say, oh, dunamis is where we get the word dynamite. Therefore, this is dynamite power that God is giving, which is an explosive, destructive power for one thing, not a constructive, useful power in the spiritual sense. And by the way, dynamite didn't exist in the first century. So when we try to take the word dynamite and read it back into the text, you're reading a word that means something today that had no meaning then. That is a mistake. Then there's the overload fallacy. This fallacy is the idea that a word will contain all of its meanings every time it's used, right? We wouldn't want to take all of the possible definitions of a word and say all of these are to be read into this text. Like, that word can't mean all 5 things at the same time and in the same relationship in that text. We're trying to overload it if we try to say it means all of that, right? It's like the word spring or trunk. It can't mean all of those things. By the way, I think I left out the other trunk meaning. An elephant has a trunk, right? So there's another meaning of trunk, again, dependent on context. How about the word count fallacy that's mentioned? This occurs when we insist that a word must have the same meaning every time it occurs. We know that that's not the case. Just because a word is used many times doesn't mean that it means the same thing every single time. And then there's an example given to you in the book. Darrell Bock maintains, again, word meanings are determined by context, not word counts. Then there's the word concept fallacy that occurs when we insist that once we've studied one word, we've studied an entire concept. And they give the example of the Greek term ekklesia, translated church. It would be a mistake to conclude that once you've studied that word, you'll know all that the New Testament teaches about the church. Well, the church is also called the bride of Christ and the body of Christ and the people of God and the sheep of God's flock. And so the word ekklesia refers to the church, but it doesn't say everything that there is to be known about the church. And then the selective evidence fallacy occurs when we cite only the evidence that supports our favorite interpretation, or when we dismiss evidence that argues against our view. And this goes back to a previous discussion about what do we bring to the text, and talking about pre-understanding and our baggage that we bring to a text of Scripture. It's important for us to remember that we can get in the way of faithful biblical exegesis and interpretation. And we have to be honest, and it's a matter of integrity if we say, I don't want to include this information because I don't want my view to be wrong. That's very, very dangerous. So check your heart at all times. So how do we conduct a word study? There are 3 basic word study steps. Number 1, choose your words. Okay, and this information is on your slide. It's also in your textbook. And you choose your words. Number 2, you determine what the word could mean, right? You look at all your possibilities. I mean, this happens when you look in any standard dictionary or lexicon of words. You'll have multiple possible meanings of a word. That's your range of meaning. It can't mean all those things, but you have to determine based on the context which one is right in that passage. And so that's number 3, determine what the word does mean in context. So choose your word, determine what it could mean, and then what it does mean in context. So look for words that are crucial to the passage. You can't and shouldn't do a word study on every single word, but look for key words. Key words will be repeated words, figures of speech, words that are unclear, puzzling, difficult, odd, unusual, that you would want to study. And so you'll take those key words and you'll use resources like a concordance to study them. and to find out their semantic range. The semantic range is what a word could mean. So once we see all the possible meanings of word, that's referring to the semantic range, or the range of meaning. Once you have that, you'll be in a better position to decide what the word does mean in a specific context. There's an example given to you there on page 170 of using the word hand to reveal a range of meaning for that particular word. So you should use an English dictionary to find the meaning of an English word, but going straight to an English dictionary to find the range of meaning for a Greek or Hebrew word is potentially a huge mistake. So you want to be able to study the original word that's behind the English translation. So again, I'm going to leave some of this to you just for your reading, but this is a chapter that you'll want to slow down, really slow down, and read carefully, and consider how to do a word study carefully, and then you'll practice doing so in your exercises. Now, there is something I want to mention in the assignment. There's one assignment, I believe, this week that requires you to, if you choose this particular assignment, you'll need to use a concordance that is a particular one, and if you don't have access to it, you should not do that assignment. And that's exercise 9-1. It requires the NIV Exhaustive Concordance, also titled the Strongest NIV Exhaustive Concordance, that's available. If you don't use that particular concordance, that particular assignment will not work. So if you have that concordance, choose that, or if you can get access to it from a pastor or at a Bible college or seminary maybe near you, then consider that assignment. So again, this chapter does a good job of pointing out that context determines the meaning of a word. And one of the most reliable ways to let the context guide your decision is through the concept known as the circles of context. And they give you that again on page 177. So you want to consider and just practice this, doing a word study. And you'll find that, again, I think you'll be astonished at how language works. Sometimes we don't realize that that language can get complicated, and even the way we use it every day is more complicated than we realize until we slow down and see how we use words every day that have meaning in context, that if they were taken out of context would have a completely different meaning used in another way. So there's a lot in this chapter on word studies. There's a lot for you to examine and consider this week. But again, in order for us to get to a good stopping place at the end of this quarter in preparation for next quarter, you'll need to double up this week and look at literary context along with word studies, which really work hand in hand with one another. And I think you'll really appreciate this. This is a rigorous part of learning hermeneutics, but it's a very important part. So I hope that everything that you have, your resources, your book, your slides, and your own practice will all come together and serve you well this week. God bless you. Thank you for your faithful work, and I appreciate every one of you. God bless you. I'm praying for you.